So, what does Irish broadcasting look like in the 1920s and 1930s? Well, I'm going to start with a point which I'm going to emphasize over and over again, that the key determinant of the content of Irish broadcasting in the first 2 decades is the financial constraints imposed upon the service by the Department of Finance. Um, and this remains the case until the end of the Second World War. And the extent of this is illustrated by the fact that both the original station directors, Seamus Clandillan and T.J. Kiernan, threatened to resign during their respective sort of regimes, if you like, if they didn't get more money from the Department of Finance. And on both occasions, the Department of Finance called their bluff, and on both occasions, they didn't resign. But that was how far they were driven by the limits of the finance that were made available to them. And the intention from finance's perspective was very much that the service should be, to the extent that it was at all possible, should be self-sustaining, and that it should not constitute a drain, basically, on the central exchequer resources. Although 2RN and subsequently Radio Éireann had an ambition, I suppose, to run the service on a kind of a public service broadcasting basis, the financial constraints meant that the channel was basically unable to provide anything like the variety of programming that would have implied. Staffing in the 1920s was limited to just 6 people, and these were all kind of clerical staff from the civil service who had no previous experience of broadcasting, although in fairness, where would you have gotten that experience from? Plus they had a part-time musical director and a station announcer. Even the first head, the first station director, Seamus Clandillan, had come to run 2RN basically from a post of he'd been a health inspector, I think, in Galway. Albeit he was somebody who did have a more than a keen interest in traditional music. He was in fact recognised as something of an expert on Irish traditional music in particular, and he organised Feis Ceoil, for example, all around the country. There were plans to bring the number of people working for the station up to 20, but as late as 1939, just before the First World War broke out, there was still only 11 full-time staff and a part-time musical director. Although having said that, by the time the war broke out, they had a full-time conductor and there was a radio orchestra of 29 musicians. So there were some resources gradually, handed over to the station. And as a consequence of this, initially 2RN concentrates on the cheapest form of programming which is available to it, and that basically is music, and often in fact live music. It has been suggested, somewhat unfairly perhaps, that the fact that the first 2 directors of the station both had wives who were capable of singing may have been, crucial factors in their husbands' appointments. Certainly, Seamus Clandillan's wife, Mairead Ní Anigan, appeared so frequently that she became nicknamed Mairead Ní An again, and presumably she was working for a relatively cheap fee. In 1935, T.J. Kiernan read a paper on the developing power of broadcasting to the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland, and his findings are kind of interesting. He did an analysis of basically what categories of content 2RNs, or at that stage Radio Éireann's, broadcasting fell into, and he found that music easily predominated. In total, Kiernan broke RTE's output, or Radio Éireann's output, in 1935 as follows. Music was, to be precise, 67% of total output. Talks accounted for 22% of total output. Variety shows, 5% of total output. Drama, just over 3.5%. Sport, 1.6%. And you're left with about sort of 1% of sort of miscellaneous material. So music absolutely predominates, and of course it's worth stressing that this is a time when there's one channel. So if you didn't like music, there wasn't somewhere else to turn unless you could tune into broadcasts from outside Ireland altogether. The talks that Kiernan mentioned tended to be very sort of pedagogic or educational in nature. So they're programs which are about, for example, teaching languages, or it's about gardening, it's about poultry keeping, it's historical subjects, for example. News obviously also looms large. Half of the talks were accounted for basically by news content. And this is very limited news service, though, it must be said. RTE didn't have its own journalists at this point, and wouldn't in fact have them pretty much for the first 20 years of its existence. The contents were taken from either content or news that had been broadcast on other stations, on foreign stations, and you also had a kind of a summary in the evenings of what the daily papers basically had said. Sports do feature, and it is asserted that the first ever live broadcast of a field game in Europe is the 2RN 1926 broadcast of that year's All-Ireland hurling semi-final. But it's still, kind of, as you can see, a relatively small proportion of the overall schedule. But what I suppose is really striking is the almost complete absence, in fact, the complete absence of any kind of substantive political broadcasting. Again, the fact that 2RN was run as a direct arm of the state meant that there was simply no space for that kind of content. Perhaps the most significant developments that occurred with regard to the station during the 20s and 30s had very little to do with content and everything to do with the actual geographical reach of the service. A bit of context for this is useful, especially understanding of what kind of radio sets were available. Basically, there are two types in the 20s and 30s. You've got crystal sets and you've got valve sets. Now, a crystal set is very simple, can be built yourself if you have the resources, and can be bought relatively cheaply. By contrast, a valve set is a much more complicated and much more expensive piece of equipment. So, although a crystal set might be within reach of the average family, a valve set was beyond most of them. But the distinction between these two is that a valve set could pick up signals from very far away. So that even if you were in Galway, if you had 5 or 6 valve sets, and the geographical reach of the sets was determined by the number of valves in them, if you're in Galway with a 5 or 6 valve set, you could probably pick up a Dublin station. If you could only afford a crystal set and you were outside Dublin, then you probably couldn't pick up the signal at all. Crystal set had a reception range of maybe 20 to 25 miles. The original intention was that after the McKee Barracks transmitter opened in 2026, that it would be augmented by 3 further sort of repeater stations based around the country, one in Cork, one in Galway, and somewhere in the northwest. The first of these repeater stations, 6CK, opened in Cork in 1927. And indeed, for the first 3 years of its existence, it also produced a certain amount of Cork-specific, that is, local opt-out programming. So it's a brief experiment with regional programming, you might say.
Since the Dublin station opened on January the 1st, 1926, our policy has been to concentrate as much as possible on the cultivation and preservation of our traditional Irish.
However, due to economic limits, in 1930, 6CK shut down as a programme maker, and from that point onwards only existed to relay, basically, stations. But the other 2 stations were simply never built. And the effect of this is that for the first 5 or 6 years of the service, if you lived outside Dublin or Cork, you pretty much didn't get access to the radio signal at all. However, in 1927, J.J. Walsh had announced plans to build a high-powered transmitter, a 60 kilowatt transmitter, as opposed to the 1.5 kilowatt transmitter based in McKee Barracks. And the intention of this was to allow the entire country to be served, even if they only had crystal sets. This is eventually realised in the opening of the Athlone transmitter in 1932, which was first brought into service to allow relays or broadcast relays of that year's International Eucharistic Congress, a huge kind of celebration of the Catholic Church, which took place in Ireland that year. It shut down again after the Congress was over, but then finally came back on air in 1933. And for a period, in fact, the service was known simply as Radio Athlone before Radio Éireann became the official title. There would be subsequent experiments in further extending the signal through the use of shortwave communications, they begin to experiment with this in the 1930s, but it's not really until wartime that they kind of seriously, and immediately after the Second World War, that they put serious resources into this. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about just why the finances of the station were so precarious for the first 20 years. The initial intention had been that 2RN would be funded by a combination of license fees and advertising. But license fee revenue fell far short of what was being spent on the operation of the station, in part because of large-scale evasion. By mid-July 1926, there were only 5,000 licensed sets around the country, at a point when it was estimated that there were at least 25,000 homes with their own sets listening in. So huge, 80% evasion of license fee being an issue. So at the close of 1926, they had raised just about 5,000 punts from the license fee, but they were spending between 25,000 and 26 and 30,000 each year on the station. So there's a huge kind of gap to be made up there. So there's a need to subvent the license fee from other sources. Advertising, as we'll see, isn't the answer to doing that, at least in the 1920s. So what gets them over the hump, if you like, in the late 1920s is the addition of a tax, an import duty onto radio sets brought into Ireland from outside and then sold on to domestic consumers. And the tax is very substantial. It increased the price of a radio set by about a third. But in fact, import duties in the 1920s and early 1930s come to constitute the single largest source of revenue for the broadcasting service. And you can see this by looking at this table. In 1926 to 1927, the service takes in just shy of 10,000 punts from the license fee, but it earns nearly twice as much from import duties. Meanwhile, advertising is barely making a dent at just £200. And if anything, the gap between revenue from import duties and license fee increases as the 20s moves into the 1930s. Look at the figure here for 1932, 1933. They earned 17,000 from license fees in that year, but nearly 65,000 from import duties. And note again that advertising is still very small in this period. And the problem with this reliance on import duties is that it simply wasn't sustainable, because license fees had to be paid on an annual basis. Every year you owned it, you had to pay a license fee, but you only paid an import duty once when you actually acquired a radio set for the first time. So inevitably, whilst license fees were going to stay, whilst license fees would slowly increase as the number of people with licenses actually increased, the revenues in the long term from import duties were going to have to decline as they reached a saturation point of radio set ownership. So where does advertising fit into these stations' revenues? Well, by the end of the 1920s, advertising appeared to be essentially irrelevant. You had years in the 1920s where advertising accounted for less than £100 of income. And there was a feeling indeed that perhaps it might be allowed to disappear entirely, so you'd only have license fee and import duty income. However, with the announcement of an Irish high-powered transmitter, what would become Radio Athlone, a radical change in attitude towards advertising begins to emerge. And it's a move away from assuming that advertising meant spot ads, so like a 30-second ad on the radio, towards sponsorship of programs, so sponsoring an entire show. In particular, interest was expressed by firms who wanted to advertise into the UK market. And of course, you have to remember that the BBC did not permit advertising. And so in October 1930, you see the beginning of an experiment with ads on Irish radio. Radio Publicity Limited, which was a London-based firm, began to basically rent time on 2RN for £5 an hour, and they sublet that time to advertisers. Those advertisers weren't necessarily based in the UK. Irish brands availed of it as well. So you would have had at Sweet Afton cigarettes buying basically ad time or buying radio time on 2RN. You would have had Finlaters, the wine merchants, independent newspapers, but perhaps most famously you had the Irish hospital sweepstakes, and this was basically, I suppose, a form of state gambling, a kind of precursor, basically, to the National Lottery. These sponsored programs, sponsored by Sweet Afton and the Independent and Irish Sweepstakes, they seem to solve a couple of problems. A, they brought in revenue. Secondly, certainly the hospital sweepstakes program actually had more money put into its production than competing 2RN programs, so it actually brought more variety and more higher production values to the schedule. And this basically seemed to improve the variety of material that was on offer via 2RN to its audiences.
On behalf of the Irish Hospital Sweepstakes, this is Ian Priest Limitral
And Bart Bastable.
wishing you all health, happiness, and good fortune. And remember,
It makes no difference where you are. You can wish upon a star.
good night to you all.
Good night, and goodbye now.
In autumn 1932, with the opening of Radio Athlone just a few months away, advertisements began to appear in UK and Irish papers inviting applications to supply sponsored programs on 2RN. So what you basically had was international commercial broadcasting being envisaged here in the form of sponsored programs targeting the UK market. Athlone Radio Publicity Limited, so a subsidiary of Radio Athlone, was formed to act as a kind of a conduit between advertisers and between the radio station itself. And from April 1933, you had 1 hour per night, 6 nights per week, set aside purely for these sponsored programs. Now, in the event, they had some difficulties attracting interest because they had set the price basically of renting space for sponsored programs at too high a rate. And as a consequence, some of the programming that came in after 1933 tended to be quite cheap. This is the sponsored programming. Again, the only exception to this is the Irish Hospital Sweepstakes program, which continued to put out programs at a much higher standard. But there was also, I suppose, a concern with not just the quality, but the un-Irish nature of this programming, which you recall was being made for both the UK and Irish markets. However, the fact that it was earning nearly as much revenue as the license fee meant the Department of Finance was reluctant to abandon this experiment. And again, you can see by 1933, 1934, just how much money is coming in. And this does lead to a transformation in the way that the station was financed. Specifically, the Department of Finance began to reconsider the role of import duties, and these had initially been legitimated as a way of paying for the startup costs of the service and then for the establishment of Radio Athlone. But once those costs were out of the way, the import duties were basically pure gravy as far as the Department of Finance was concerned. In 1935, for example, if you factored in the income from import duties, then in fact the state as a whole made a profit of about £100,000 on the operation of 2RN. And in 1934, the previous year, the Department of Finance basically made the decision to simply take the import duties away from the broadcasting service and simply absorb them into the central exchequer. So that from that point onwards, 2RN, Radio Athlone, Radio Éireann becomes entirely dependent on advertising revenue and on license fee revenue. Clearly, this hurt the service to lose such a chunk of kind of reliable income basically overnight. And things were made even tougher still by the fact that there was an increasing concern in official circles, including at the level of government, that the development of advertising was kind of associating the voice of Ireland overseas with cheapness, basically. So it was a voice selling cheap goods with cheap programs. And so the government attempts in the mid-1930s to sort of encourage the station, well, it instructs the station basically to get rid of the less creditable advertising, to hang on to the hospital's sweepstakes program, and to leave it to the broadcasting services to take other reputable advertising, on the condition that only companies that were actually based within the Irish Free State or products that were being manufactured in the Free State could actually be advertised. This hurt substantially. Ad revenue dropped by about £9,000 between 1934 and 1935. But this was gradually compensated by an increase in the number of people actually shelling out for a license fee. In 1933, it's just 33,000 licenses bought across the country. That goes to 50,000 or just over in 1934, 62,000 in 1936, 1935, and finally to over 100,000 by 1936. So clearly people thought there was at least something worth paying for.